The hotshot CEO smirked as she ripped up a struggling single dad's contract, illegally seizing his tiny business and telling him, "Go cry to a lawyer." The smirk vanished permanently when they went to court, and the presiding Supreme Court judge immediately stood up and bowed to the single dad. If you love seeing arrogant elites get completely destroyed by the law, stay until the very end. The office of Victoria Vance was a monument to the kind of power that feeds on the air it breathes. 40 stories above the New York skyline, the walls were not made of brick and mortar, but of reflective glass and cold, brushed steel. The air was filtered, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood and unspoken threats. The building wasn't designed to welcome guests. It was designed to remind them of their insignificance. Arthur Sterling stood in the center of this temple of ego, feeling like a smudge on a pristine lens. He was 45, but the silver at his temples and the deep lines around his mouth suggested a man who had lived through a century of winters. He wore a faded brown canvas jacket, a white shirt that had been ironed one too many times, and shoes that carried the honest gray dust of the subway. Beside him, clutching a battered leather satchel filled with school books, was 8-year-old Lily. She had her father's eyes, amber, analytical, and unnervingly steady. She didn't look at the expensive art on the walls. She looked at the way the light reflected off the polished floor, mapping the geometry of the room in her head. Victoria Vance leaned back in her Italian leather chair, her fingers laced together. She was 35, dressed in an immaculate white Tom Ford suit that repelled light. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, high-polished bun. She looked like a predator who had just finished a meal and was now simply playing with the bones. To Victoria, human worth was measured entirely by net worth. A man in a canvas jacket was not a partner. He was an overhead cost. On the mahogany desk between them lay a single sheet of paper. It was the Aegis 7 algorithm agreement, Arthur's life's work. 3 years of sleepless nights condensed into a series of paragraphs. "The software is stabilizing, Arthur," Victoria said, her voice a smooth, disruptive baritone that carried the chill of the office air. "But the board feels that a 3% royalty for a freelance contractor is an unnecessary drain on our quarterly projections. We've decided to internalize the project." Arthur's jaw tightened, a small, rhythmic pulse appearing at his temple. "Internalize? Victoria, we signed a contract. I built that security core from nothing. It's the only reason your company survived the overseas breach last month. That royalty was meant for Lily's medical fund." Victoria's smile didn't fade, it sharpened. It became the arrogant smirk of a woman who had never been told no by anyone she considered an equal. "Contracts are like ghosts, Arthur," she whispered, leaning forward until the scent of her perfume clashed with the honest smell of Arthur's black coffee. "They only exist if you believe in them. And right now, I've decided to stop believing. Our R&D team has filed a new patent. Your contribution? It's been erased from the documentation." With a slow, deliberate motion, she picked up the paper and tore it apart. The sound sliced through the filtered air. Lily's breath hitched, her small fingers finding the hem of her father's jacket. Victoria didn't stop until the agreement was nothing but a handful of white confetti. She tossed the pieces into the air, watching them flutter down onto Arthur's worn work boots. "There," she said, her lip curling in disdain. "Your tiny business is now mine. The code is patented under Vance Cybernetics. If you don't like it, you can take your little daycare project here and go cry to a lawyer. Although in this city, lawyers like mine eat men like you for breakfast. Security will show you to the service elevator." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice to defend his dignity. He understood a truth Victoria Vance had long ago buried under layers of stock options. A man's worth is defined by the weight of the truths he is willing to carry, not the fabric he wears. He looked at the torn paper on the floor, then up at Victoria. There was no anger in his eyes. There was only a profound, chilling pity. "You think you've destroyed the paper, Victoria," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "But the law is not on the paper. The law is in the air. You're just the only one who can't feel the storm coming." He knelt down, his large, scarred hands picking up every single piece of the torn document. He placed them gently into Lily's satchel. "Come on, Firefly," he whispered to his daughter. "We need to go. The air is getting thin in here." As they walked toward the door, Victoria's laughter followed them, a high, brittle sound that rang off the glass walls. She thought she had won. She thought she had roundly defeated a ghost. She didn't know that she had just committed the greatest mistake of her life. Arthur's apartment in Queens was the exact opposite of the Vance headquarters. It was a 3-room walk-up that smelled of old parchment, strong black coffee, and the lavender-scented laundry detergent Lily liked. The walls were not made of reflective glass. They were made of knowledge. Thousands of books, thick, leather-bound volumes with cracked spines and millions of handwritten notes in the margins lined every inch of the hallway. To his neighbors, Arthur was the quiet widower who walked his daughter to school every morning and spent his nights glowing in the blue light of 3 high-end monitors. They knew him as a man who could fix a computer or an engine with a few precise movements of his hands, but they never asked about his past. They never noticed the Harvard Law Professor Emeritus diploma tucked behind a stack of old National Geographics in the dark corner of the closet. Arthur Sterling had once been the most feared name in legal academia. He was the architect who had authored the Sterling Doctrine, the very foundation of modern intellectual property law. But when a car accident had taken his wife and left Lily with a heart condition that required expensive, specialized care, he had walked away from the ivory towers. He wanted a world where the stakes were smaller, a world where he could be a father first and a genius second. He had built the Aegis 7 algorithm not for fame, but to pay for the surgery Lily needed in Cleveland. He had trusted Victoria Vance because her father had once been his student, a man of integrity. He hadn't realized that integrity is not a hereditary trait. "Daddy," Lily said, sitting at the kitchen table as Arthur boiled water for tea. She had laid out the torn pieces of the contract on the wooden surface, attempting to piece them together like a jigsaw puzzle. Why did the lady break her promise? Doesn't she know the rules? Arthur turned, the steam from the kettle rising around his head like a halo of white smoke. He looked at his daughter, at her innocence and her unwavering faith in the concept of the rules. "Some people think the rules are walls to keep others out, Lily," Arthur said quietly. "They don't realize that the rules are actually the floor they're standing on. When you break them, eventually the floor disappears." He sat down beside her and looked at the puzzle of torn paper. He could have just used his encrypted backup files. He could have called old friends in the Department of Justice who owed him favors that could bankrupt a small country. But Arthur Sterling was a man of the process. He believed that for justice to be real, it had to be seen. "We're going to go to court, Lily," he said, his voice as steady as the ticking clock on the wall. "With a lawyer?" she asked. Arthur looked at his calloused hands, the hands of a man who worked for what he owned. "No, we're going to go as ourselves, because in a room full of lies, the truth doesn't need a bodyguard." While Arthur was brewing coffee in Queens, Victoria Vance was celebrating in a VIP booth at a club in Soho. The launch of the Aegis 7 core had been a seismic success. Within 6 hours of the press release, the company's stock had surged by 22%. The software was a masterpiece. It wasn't just a firewall, it was a predictive immune system for digital infrastructure. It learned from attacks. It grew stronger with every breach. It was the future of global defense, and Victoria Vance was being hailed as its visionary architect. Her CFO, a man named Marcus Rowe, leaned in over the pulsing bass of the music. "Victoria, the auditors are asking about the primary developer's signature on the transfer of rights. We don't have the finalized digital copy in the vault." Victoria sipped her vintage champagne, her eyes reflecting the neon lights like a shark's. "We don't need a signature, Marcus. Arthur Sterling is a ghost. He has no money, no firm, and no reputation. I tore up the original in front of him. He's a nobody. I have a team of 6 lawyers who have already drafted a work-for-hire affidavit stating the code was developed internally by our R&D team. Header or And if he sues? Marcus asked, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. Victoria laughed, a high, sharp sound that was lost in the music. With what? He'll spend the next 6 months trying to find a lawyer who will take his case for free. By the time he realizes that I own every major firm in this city, we'll have sold the company to the defense consortium for $4 billion. By then, he'll be just another sad story in a subway station. She stood up, smoothing the front of her white suit. People like Arthur Sterling think the world runs on ideas. They're wrong. The world runs on the audacity to take what you want and the power to keep it. Victoria Vance was a woman who had built a skyscraper on a foundation of stolen glass. She didn't realize that when you steal from a man who understands the very molecules of the glass, he doesn't need a hammer to break it. He only needs to wait for the right vibration. 2 days before the court date, Arthur made one final attempt to resolve the matter quietly. He didn't want the drama of a public hearing. He wanted the medical funds he was owed so he could take Lily to Cleveland. He arrived at the Vance building at noon. The security guard, who had been given a photograph of Arthur, refused to let him past the glass turnstiles. "Ms. Vance is in a perpetual meeting," the guard said, his voice a wall of indifference. "You aren't on the cleared list." "I'll wait," Arthur said. He sat on a cold stone bench in the lobby for 4 hours. Lily sat beside him, reading a book on constitutional law that Arthur had given her for her birthday. People in $5,000 suits walked past them, giving them the same look they gave a crack in the sidewalk. They were invisible. Finally, Victoria appeared. She was walking toward the revolving doors, surrounded by her legal team, 6 men in charcoal suits who looked like they were made of the same cold steel as the building. "Arthur," Victoria said, stopping in her tracks as she noticed the man in the canvas jacket. Her smirk returned, more poisonous than before. "I thought I told you to go cry to a lawyer. Why are you still here? Are you looking for a job as a janitor? We might have an opening in the sub-basement cleaning the grease traps." The lawyers laughed. It was a pinstriped, expensive sound. Arthur stood up, his height surprising the lawyers who had misjudged his frame. He looked at the lead counsel, a man named Benjamin Graves, whose firm Arthur had literally helped name 20 years ago. Graves didn't recognize him. Arthur had aged, his hair had thinned, and he was currently wearing a jacket that cost less than Graves' tie. "Victoria," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a cold wind. "I'm giving you one chance. Pay the royalty. Give me the credit for the core. If we walk into that courtroom on Monday, there is no turning back. I will take everything you have, not because I want it, but because you don't deserve it." Victoria stepped closer, her expensive scent clashing with the honest smell of Arthur's skin. "Monday?" she whispered. "Arthur, on Monday, my lawyers are going to file a motion for summary judgment. They're going to prove you're an unstable, failed coder who tried to extort a billionaire. I'm not just going to take your software. I'm going to take your dignity. I'm going to make sure that for the rest of your life, when people hear the name Sterling, they think of a fraud." She looked at Lily, who was holding Arthur's hand. "And your daughter? I hope she likes the foster system, because by the time I'm done with the legal fees and the countersuits, you won't even be able to afford a cardboard box." Victoria turned to her lawyers. "Let's go. The air is starting to smell like poverty." Arthur watched them walk away. He felt Lily's hand tremble in his. He squeezed it once, a firm, grounding pressure. "Don't worry, Firefly," he murmured, his eyes following the white suit of Victoria Vance as it disappeared into a black Maybach. "The higher the tower, the louder the crash." Monday morning arrived with a sky the color of lead. The rain didn't fall. It hung in the air like a wet shroud over the city. Arthur Sterling and Lily sat on a wooden bench outside the federal courthouse. Arthur was wearing his only suit, a charcoal wool piece that was 20 years old but still held its shape. He had spent the previous night ironing it by hand, his movements slow and rhythmic, like a priest preparing for a ritual. He looked at his daughter. She was wearing a clean blue dress and had her hair tied in 2 neat braids. "Are you scared, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small against the noise of the city traffic. Arthur looked at the massive stone pillars of the courthouse. To most people, they were symbols of intimidation. To him, they were home. They were the bones of the world he had helped build. "No, Lily," he said, adjusting the lapel of his old suit. "I'm not scared. I spent 25 years of my life inside buildings like this. I know where every stone is laid. I know how the echoes work." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pin. It was the Scales of Justice, an award given to him by the Supreme Court decades ago for his contributions to civil liberties. He pinned it to the inside of his lapel, hidden from view. "Just remember," he told her, his amber eyes reflecting the gray light, "the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be constant." The federal courtroom was a cavern of mahogany, velvet, and the heavy, airless weight of the law. Victoria Vance arrived at 9:01 a.m. sharp. She didn't walk. She marched. She was followed by her 6 lawyers, 2 assistants, and 3 PR representatives. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her white suit a blinding contrast to the dark wood of the room. She looked at the gallery, where several members of the press had gathered, and smiled for the cameras. This was her stage. Arthur and Lily walked in 5 minutes later. They sat at the defense table alone. Arthur opened a single leather briefcase, the same one he had used at his first lecture at Harvard in 1998. He took out a pad of yellow legal paper and a single fountain pen. Lily sat in the first row of the gallery, her satchel on her lap. Victoria leaned over to Benjamin Graves, her lead counsel. "Look at him," she whispered, her smirk visible to the entire room. "He brought a yellow pad to a federal hearing. He looks like a high school history teacher who lost his way." Graves nodded, his eyes fixed on Arthur with a look of bored superiority. "Don't worry, Victoria. Judge Thorne is known for his intolerance of procedural errors. Arthur won't last 10 minutes before the judge dismisses the case with prejudice. This will be over by lunch." At 9:15, the bailiff's voice rang through the room like a gunshot. "All rise. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is now in session. The Honorable Justice Samuel Thorne presiding." The room stood in a synchronized wave of fabric and breath. Justice Samuel Thorne was 50 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a mountain. He was known as the Iron Gavel, a man whose commitment to the letter of the law was absolute and unforgiving. He walked to the bench with a pace that was deliberate and heavy. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the cameras. He sat down, adjusted his spectacles, and looked at the docket. "Vance Cybernetics versus Sterling," the judge said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Case number 44, Bravo 7. Intellectual property dispute regarding the Aegis 7 Security Corps. Ein Choris and Trodi et." He looked up, his eyes scanning the room. First, he looked at Victoria Vance. He saw the white suit and the arrogant smirk. His expression didn't change. Then, his gaze moved to the defense table. He saw a man in an old suit sitting alone with a yellow pad. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Justice Thorne's hands, resting on the mahogany bench, suddenly went still. His eyes narrowed. He looked at Arthur Sterling's face, really looked at it, for 5 long, agonizing seconds. Then, to the absolute horror of Victoria Vance and the confusion of every lawyer in the room, the iron gavel did the unthinkable. Justice Samuel Thorne stood up. He didn't just stand, he straightened his robe as if he were in the presence of royalty. He walked to the edge of the bench, looked directly at the man in the faded charcoal suit, and bowed. A deep, formal, and profoundly respectful bow. "Professor Sterling," the judge said, his voice trembling with a resonance that silenced the entire building. "I didn't know you were back in New York. It is the greatest honor of my career to see you in my courtroom." The silence in the courtroom was not just the absence of sound. It was a physical weight. It was the sound of an entire empire's heart stopping. Victoria Vance's smirk didn't just fade, it evaporated. Her mouth hung open, her gaze darting between the bowing judge and the peasant at the defense table. "Professor?" she whispered, her voice a jagged reed. Benjamin Graves, her lead lawyer, felt the blood drain from his face until his skin was the color of a white sheet. He looked at Arthur Sterling, at the eyes, at the set of the shoulders, at the way he held his pen. "Oh my God," Graves whispered, his voice cracking. "That's Arthur Sterling. The Arthur Sterling, the Dean of Harvard Law, the author of the Intellectual Property Statutes, the man who literally wrote the textbooks I studied for the bar exam. So Arthur Sterling stood up slowly. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked at Justice Thorne with the warm, tired smile of a teacher. "It's good to see you, Samuel," Arthur said. "I hear you've been keeping the bench honest. I'm proud of you." Justice Thorne sat back down, but he didn't return to his judge persona. He looked like a student who had just been given his final exam by his favorite mentor. "I'm sorry, Professor," the judge said, glancing at the Vance table with a look of pure, icy disdain. "I was under the impression that this was a routine extortion claim. If I had known Vance Cybernetics was attempting to litigate against the very man who defined the law they are citing, I would have held this hearing in a stadium so the world could watch the dismantling." Initensori Ginsel Atmake. Victoria Vance finally found her voice, though it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Your Honor, this is a conflict of interest. You can't bow to the defendant." Justice Thorne looked at Victoria. For the first time in 14 months, Victoria Vance felt what it was like to be the pebble in the shoe of progress. "Ms. Vance," the judge said, his voice as cold as a winter night, "in this room, I am the law, but Professor Sterling is the reason for the law. If you feel that my respect for the man who saved my career and the integrity of this country's legal system is a conflict, then I suggest you find a different country to build your buildings in, because you won't be building any more in this one. If you are enjoying this moment of absolute justice, hit the like button right now. It helps us share these stories of integrity with the world. Don't forget to comment justice below and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the Sterling family's journey. Let's see how Arthur dismantles her empire. Arthur Sterling stood at the podium with his yellow pad and his fountain pen. He stood before the jury, 6 men and women who were now leaning forward as if they were in a masterclass. "Law," Arthur began, his voice filling the room without the need for a microphone, "is not a game of hide and seek. It is a game of light. It is designed to make the invisible visible." He looked at Benjamin Graves. "Benjamin, do you remember my lecture in 1999? The one on fraudulent inducement and the doctrine of clean hands?" Graves looked down at the table, unable to meet his old professor's eyes. "Yes, Professor. I remember." "Then you know," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the gallery, "that when a CEO invites a developer to a meeting, promises them a royalty to gain access to their proprietary encryption keys, and then destroys the physical contract to erase the trail, that is not business. That is a felony." Arthur reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside were the white scraps of the contract Victoria had ripped up. "Ms. Vance told me to go cry to a lawyer," Arthur said, looking at the jury. "But she didn't realize that my daughter is very good at puzzles." Lily stood up in the gallery. She opened her satchel and pulled out a large, taped-together sheet of paper. It was the original contract, reconstructed with the meticulous care of a child who loved her father. "You see, Victoria," Arthur said, turning his gaze to her for the first time, "you thought that by destroying the paper, you destroyed the evidence. But you forgot that the paper was printed on a high-end laser printer at your office. Every page printed on a corporate machine carries a microscopic yellow tracking dot, a forensic serial number." He looked at Justice Thorne. "Your Honor, I've already submitted the forensic analysis to the court clerk. The tracking dots on these fragments prove they were printed at Vance Cybernetics headquarters on the morning of September 14th. The same morning, Ms. Vance's lawyers claimed in their filing that the contract never existed." Victoria Vance felt the room start to spin. The white suit she wore suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She looked at her lawyers, but they were no longer looking at her. They were looking at their own careers, which were currently being shredded by the man at the podium. And as for the Aegis 7 core, Arthur continued, the code contains a digital signature, a sequence of prime numbers hidden in the virtualization layer that spells out a name in ASCII code. My late wife's name, Claire. Justice Thorne looked at Victoria. Ms. Vance, do you have a response? Or should I skip the testimony and move straight to the arrest warrant for federal fraud and document forgery? The collapse was instantaneous. By noon, the board of Vance Cybernetics had issued an emergency statement distancing themselves from Victoria. By 2 p.m., the stock had hit zero. By sunset, Victoria Vance was being led out of her building in handcuffs, her immaculate white suit stained with the gray New York rain. The lawyers who had laughed at Arthur were nowhere to be found. They were busy shredding their own files, trying to erase their association with a woman who had tried to litigate against the sun. 6 months later, the Vance Cybernetics Tower was gone. It had been sold off to pay the billions in fines and settlements. Arthur Sterling sat on a wooden park bench in Queens. He was wearing his faded brown canvas jacket and drinking a cup of strong black coffee. Beside him, Lily was running across the grass, her laughter a steady, beautiful heartbeat. She was healthy. She was happy. And she had the best education that the Sterling Foundation for Digital Ethics could buy. A man in a dark suit walked up to the bench. It was Justice Samuel Thorne. He wasn't wearing his robes. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day of honest work. Professor, Thorne said, sitting down, the board of Harvard called me this morning. They want you back. They want to name the law school after you. Arthur looked at his daughter, who was currently trying to catch a falling leaf. Tell them I'm busy, Samuel, Arthur said with a quiet smile. Busy with what? Arthur looked at the sunset reflecting off the city he had helped save. I'm busy being a dad, he said. It's the only job where the royalties are paid in laughter. And unlike the law, it doesn't need to be written down to be real. Justice Thorne nodded, looking out at the park. He realized then that the most powerful man he had ever known wasn't the one with the gavel or the one with the billions. It was the one who knew that true wealth is measured by the peace of your soul when the lights go out. Arthur Sterling took Lily's hand as she ran back to him. Geometry never lies, Daddy, she whispered. No, Firefly, Arthur replied, and neither does the truth. True wealth isn't measured by the designer label on your suit, but by the weight of your character when you think no one important is watching. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that a father's fierce love and quiet, undeniable competence will always defeat loud arrogance, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where justice is served cold. Until next time, stay strong and never judge a book by its cover.